With the 2023 NBA season coming to a close, it's time to rank the game's best players. This is the final part of a 5-video series breaking down my top 25. But before we continue the rankings, I'll do a quick rundown of my criteria. The question I'm answering is if I'm trying to contend for a championship, who's going to offer the most value at that level? This means I'm more focused on the playoffs, looking at the different skill sets and tendencies of each player in the context of a competitive team. I'm also looking at when these players are actually on the floor. Injuries weren't heavily considered unless they directly impacted that player's production. For a more in-depth look at everything I value and the entire criteria, make sure to check out the first video of the series. I'll leave a link to that in the description. Just to recap my first 20, I had Embiid and Luka as strong MVPs, AD, Dame, and Tatum as weak MVPs, Jimmy, LeBron, Booker, Zion, Mitchell, Ja, Shea, Kyrie, and PG as all NBA level players, Trey, Bam, Murray, Harden, Jaren, and Anthony Edwards as all-star level players. And without further ado, let's continue the rankings. Coming in at 5, I've got Kevin Durant. KD's probably the best mid-range shooter in NBA history. He's got an absurdly high release that gives him unlimited access to looks over the top and is super smooth, getting the ball up off the floor in a variety of ways, capable of hitting while on the move or drifting in any direction. A bit closer to the basket, he's comfortable going to little floaters or hooks if he can't get to his jumper, and the difficult shot making required on some of his baskets is absurd, making that scoring all the more impressive. These things allow him to operate from anywhere on the floor, whether that's a face-up isolation, a post-up, a pick and roll, but come playoff time, he does run into some troubles as a creator. He has an incredibly loose handle, which has always been the case, but he used to have a lot more burst and agility, so he could weaponize that length by throwing super exaggerated changes of direction and hesitations. But now we routinely see on-ball defenders get up under his handle and limit his ability to get into the defense. Even if he does beat that first defender, off-ball guys are sitting in gaps, and he really struggles taking those extra dribbles to get through the defense, turning the ball over in bunches. So he instead picks up his handle and settles for much tougher shots. Now, one way to counter this would be getting him the ball in more advantageous spots, such as in the mid-post or coming off of movement inside the arc, and this works to some extent as he's just a brilliant, versatile shot maker. But on top of the loose handle, he also really lacks strength. He can't really back defenders down, and it's really easy to bump him off his spot. So again, he's often settling for contested fall-away jumpers. These things have essentially shut off an entire level of the court for him come playoff time, and that level is the most efficient spot in basketball. Over his last 3 postseasons, just 2 shots at the rim every 75 possessions, dead last among the players I sampled for this list, and even less than a guy like Draymond Green, who often doesn't even look at the hoop. So while he's commonly labeled a 3-level scorer, he definitely is not hurting defenses from all 3 levels. Despite this, he's still really good at getting to the line, initiating and selling contact well, using up fakes and rip throughs to generate free throws, which he capitalizes on. As an off-the-dribble 3-point shooter, he's of course effective, but can be a little inconsistent, and as a result, almost all of his offense is coming in the mid-range, which playoff defenses can zone in on, and really limit his attack as a shot creator. I do still think he's one of the best off-ball players in the NBA though, an elite shooter off the catch with active, high-feel movement. He's a lethal weapon in set actions as a mover inside the arc, coming off of screens with impossible to contest jumpers, countering overplays with some sharp cutting, and making quick decisions on the fly. In general, he's one of the quickest attackers ever, just destroying closeouts and tilted defenses, but again, instead of dunks or layups, these have been turned pretty exclusively into mid-range pull-ups. Regardless, if you put him next to any sort of high-level playmaking, he's still an absolutely ridiculous scorer. That shot making will always give his scoring a floor. He's just too good to not add immense value in that regard. but it's not quite the same as what we saw in years past. Of course, he's not in the same situations, but less driving, less transition play, and the added limitations as a creator have hurt his ability to generate that level of offense in the postseason. With that said, I do think this is the best version we've seen from him as a passer. Obviously, without some of the rim pressure and less comfort handling in tight spaces, he may not have access to some of the same angles, but his decision making, vision, and ability to get the ball from point A to point B have noticeably improved. He'll leverage his scoring well by faking shot attempts into dump-offs or shovel passes down low, and when help comes from one pass away, he'll quickly move the ball, a pretty sharp decision maker in these spots. From a standstill, he sees the floor a lot better, and this is where you'll see him throw in some occasional skip passes, nice finds to cutters, and he gets doubled off the catch a lot, so there's some pretty big creation here. Still, I mentioned some of the turnover issues. These come from some passing errors as well, trying to sneak the ball through non-existent windows, or just tossing inaccurate deliveries. So he's still limited as a playmaker, and I think that prevents him from being a one-man offense in the way that we see from some of these other juggernauts. Overall, the dynamic nature of his attack, and that ability to take on so many different roles both on and off the ball, does leave him a super high-level offensive player, adding near strong MVP value on that end in my opinion. Defensively, he's a pretty strong rim protector with the length, timing, and ball targeting needed to really make a difference when in position on the backline. He's not a great processor, not making a ton of high-level help plays, and prone to missing some rotations, and the lack of strength does hurt, getting bumped down low, and not offering any resistance in the post. He is still a pretty switchable man defender though. He moves his feet pretty well in space, and smothers ball handlers with his length. He's obviously not someone you want navigating screens at the point of attack, and his lack of strength leaves him somewhat vulnerable to more powerful shot creators, but generally, he'll hold his own or even do well against multiple positions, which offers some flexibility. He's far from an all-defensive level guy, but in my opinion, is a pretty noticeable positive, especially within the context of a more versatile, switching defensive scheme, which when paired with his offense, makes him a strong MVP level guy overall. As for number 4, that's Kawhi Leonard. I totally understand if the injury concerns make you a bit more hesitant, or if you just don't rank him highly at all because of that, but when on the court and playing this season, I think I saw enough. Just to compare to KD from one spot prior, every flaw I mentioned with him as a creator is actually a strength for Kawhi. Despite having extreme length himself, his handle is tight with incredible ball security, capable of dealing with aggressive ball pressure and handling through gaps, or with added off-ball aggression. This of course helps him take care of the ball much better and get to his spots inside the arc. He's also ridiculously strong, especially in the lower body, moving defenders out of his way with the use of shoulder bumps and holding his ground on drives or while playing out of the post. He'll use those bumps and that tight handle to set up mid-range jumpers, where he's an all-time level shot maker himself with tons of versatility. This holds true behind the arc as well. He's got a smooth pull-up jumper, is comfortable stopping and popping off of screens if not met with immediate resistance, and can hit through pretty heavy contests. He's also a great shooter when spotting up, and I think he's got some value off the ball, but not in the same way someone like KD does. His decisions off the catch aren't quite as quick. I don't think he's as effective off of movement or when looking to capitalize off of his gravity. I also don't think he fills out space as well or as actively. I definitely prefer Durant when playing off of someone else's creation. Regardless, Kawhi's a true 3-level scorer, and he's kind of playoff proof because of his unique physical traits and skills as a shot maker. Now, we don't have a great sample of him in recent playoffs, but if we use those last 3 years, his numbers are off the charts good, and that's kind of been a trend throughout his career. He's one of the best playoff scorers in NBA history, and I didn't see anything this season that would make me think he isn't still capable of producing. As a playmaker, he's clearly a willing and low error passer. He'll draw some aggressive coverages or see doubles and make the right read, but he's incredibly reactive and doesn't make many high-level deliveries. He also isn't manipulating the defense in any way, just sort of counter-passing when he can't get to his own shot. This is valuable playmaking, but not in the same way we see from the best on-ball engines, and I think this just holds him back in comparison to some other guys. I think when on the court, he's probably the best scorer in the game, which is enough to make him a weak MVP level offensive player, just a touch below where I view Durant. Defensively, he's ridiculously switchable. He's definitely lost some foot speed, but still quick enough to contain the ball in space, and is of course a masterful pickpocket. No handle is safe. I think he's lost some point of attack utility at this point, but still solid in that regard, and his incredibly strong lower body allows him to stonewall bigger players. He'll use his length and unrivaled hands to make plays on the ball in these spots, and these two things also fuel his game as a helper. He's constantly reaching into drives or jumping lanes, at times just completely erasing attacks, and he even offers some rim protection, not always making the rotations, but when he's there providing some nice resistance. One problem I have with his defense is sometimes his awareness off the ball is lackluster. Perhaps more than any defender of his stature, the complete breakdowns or just straight up losing cutters, and I think this does hurt his value. Overall, I don't think he's an all defensive level guy anymore, but still a really strong positive, which is enough to carry him to a strong MVP type of player overall. At 3, I've got Steph Curry. Some of this can be kept short and sweet. I mentioned the value of high field movement and activity off the ball. There's no one in NBA history better at this than Steph Curry. It also goes without saying that he's the best shooter ever, whether that's off the bounce, on the move, off the catch, from extended range. There's no one even in the conversation with him. He's also a super quick decision maker off the catch as both an attacker and extra passer, capitalizing on the threat of his movement extremely well. And these things just carry inherent value in a way that arguably nobody else in the league can do with just a select few skills. What I will say is that I actually do think some of these things have regressed in comparison to former versions of Steph. Obviously that comes with age, the movements aren't quite as sharp, not as much cutting or just breaking defenses with his sprinting around screens. But he has also added strength over the years, so he's been a lot better dealing with added physicality. Some of his regression is a bit more noticeable on the ball. I think his handle is the best it's ever been, but that's more so because of ball security and timely counter moves. The sharp changes of direction and jarring array of moves straight out of a circus don't show up as often, and I actually think this hurts his scoring. He's not getting to the rim nearly as much as he once did, and it takes more work for him to create space from beyond the arc. So by the time he's taking his 10th, 11th, 12th three-pointer in a single game, he's lost some legs. One way he's adjusted and sort of countered is by becoming one of the game's best mid-range scorers. He added a more consistent floater, with more strength, has gotten comfortable creating with the use of bumps and added contact, and like I said, is just the best shooter ever. He's still one of, if not the best scorer in the NBA, just torching defenses in so many different ways. The volume and efficiency are incredibly high marks, even if it isn't the same level we saw during his peak years. I also think it's important to note that he only hit 34% of his open threes during this most recent stretch. Obvious variance, so I do think he could be a touch more efficient than this. He's also still a really good passer, not actively bending defenses with ridiculous finds, but capitalizing on his scoring threat well. He remains a massive advantage creator from the perimeter, and can still get into the defense, finding cutters, spraying shooters, and I really like his creativity. I do think his decision making can be choppy at times, some careless turnovers or rushed decisions, but nonetheless he's one of the better passers in the league, which with his scoring threat opens up the offense in a way very few can. He plays on a defensively slanted roster with two non-spacers and complete non-scorers in the front court, but makes it work in a way that arguably no other player could. The fact that some of these lineups aren't just producing good, but great, championship level offensive numbers against the league's best playoff defenses is a testament to what Steph can do both on and off the ball. Even if he's not at his peak, I still think he's at worst a top 3 offensive player in the NBA, adding strong MVP value on that end. Defensively, the added strength has helped him as a man defender, playing a lot more physical and handsy, but he's still not a guy you want matching up with bigger attackers, as he doesn't have the height or length to really offer much resistance. I also think his continued loss of agility hurts him in space, struggling to contain the ball, and often relying on guys like Draymond or Wiggins to cover for him down low, although he will execute those peel switches or timely rotations properly, so this isn't a big deal. He's always been a smart off-ball defender positionally, with nice rotations to help take away interior threats or make plays on the ball with his lightning-quick hands. I think his motor and activity took a noticeable decline this season, but I also don't know how much of that has to do with a considerably worse defensive year from the entire team. For that reason, I'm holding back on calling him a negative. Last season I labeled him a small positive, and with another year, just some natural regression feels realistic, and I think of him as around neutral. Neutral defense, strong MVP level offense is enough to land him a spot in my top 3. Next up at 2 is Giannis. Giannis is arguably the best finisher in the NBA and can set himself up at the rim in a multitude of ways. Over the past 3 postseasons, he's attempted almost 11 shots at the rim every 75 possessions, while no other player I sampled was higher than 7. He's obviously at his best in transition. The length, speed, power, just so physically overwhelming in the open floor. In the half court, he's used as a roll man quite a bit, a devastating roller who demands a ton of attention off the ball, and is a quick enough decision maker in the short roll to take advantage of that gravity. He's also a big offensive rebounder, where second chance opportunities are pretty much a guaranteed too. And as an initiator in space, he'll build up steam with crossovers or quick changes of direction as he knifes his way in close. This constant pressure on the basket and the physical nature of his game earns him a heap of free throws, consistently leading the league in both the regular season and playoffs, although some of that is done intentionally as he's not at all a good free throw shooter. And with the standard of today's offensive efficiency, this hurts more than it would in previous eras. That applies to his lack of shooting in general, which is really only a problem because he insists on taking jumpers. At one point, the mid-range served as a legit counter, but he had a huge down year on those, which made him less effective as a creator in the half court, as when teams walled him up, he couldn't really punish them, and in isolation or post-up situations, he couldn't effectively fall back on it when unable to bully his way in deep. Even before the decline in accuracy, he already took these shots at way too much volume. Again, in the last 3 postseasons, about 8 every 75 possessions, more than names like Kyrie, Jaylen Brown, and Jason Tatum, and he's just not that level of shooter. It's the same thing from deep, 3 attempts at a measly 19%, just settling for wasted possessions a bit too much. As a result, his scoring come playoff time isn't quite as effective as it is in the regular season, but with that said, he remains one of the league's highest volume guys, while still doing it at respectable efficiency. Despite some concerns with his versatility, he's an absolutely incredible scorer, and the pressure he puts on defenses through that downhill game is historic. He's a really good passer out of drives, finding shooters all over the floor at high velocity in a seemingly endless amount of ways, but outside of these sort of set reads, his creation is slightly limited. When it comes to other decisions, he tends to miss them or just struggles getting the ball there, and this is where he runs into some turnover issues. It's not a huge deal, as he's still creating a ton of quality jumpers at volume, just when we get to this caliber of player, you kind of have to nitpick the differences. Milwaukee's definitely had some issues with their roster that he single-handedly covers up, but their offenses in the playoffs just haven't been very good. Slightly underwhelming even when considering some of those problems. I'd like to see him next to a high-level pick-and-roll operator or elite pull-up shooter, just to really see where that off-ball, downhill devastating roll game can take him as a scorer. But regardless, he's got number one capability, especially as an engine in transition, and even in a down year, I still think he's a solid All-NBA level offensive player. He more than makes up that ground in comparison to these offensive superstars with his play on the defensive end. Milwaukee's defense hasn't just been good in the playoffs, but one of the best in NBA history, and he's the anchor that makes everything work. More often than not, he's on the back line, where his agility, length, and instincts allow him to just completely erase threats at the rim, just completely changing the dynamic of opposing offenses. He covers more ground in these spots than anyone in the game, helping and recovering at will, oftentimes defending multiple players at once as he just cleans up defensive errors and makes countless high leverage plays. The activity and motor are off the charts. He'll play upwards of 40 minutes in a playoff game without taking plays off, while being an offensive engine on the other end. It's truly some two-way stuff you only see from legends. I don't think he's quite got the processing speed or ability to just read an offense like you see with a Draymond Green type, so I don't think he's perfect in these spots, but oftentimes he can miss some things and still make a play because of his one-of-one physical tools. Those tools also enable him to play as a small ball 5, or traditional anchor big, and he plays this role pretty well. When dropping in the pick and roll, his positioning can be a little awkward, but he's also mobile enough to execute any coverage you want to throw him in. The flexibility he brings to a team's defense is off the charts. He can also switch onto smaller players when needed. Of course, you don't want him isolated in space against shifty guards, but he moves well enough and has recovery skills that enable him to offer serious resistance against most positions. You sprinkle in his transition defense, rebounding, and we're seriously talking about one of the more versatile defensive bigs in NBA history. Right now, I think he's at worst a top 4 or 5 defender in the NBA, and absolutely think he has an argument as number 1, adding near All-NBA value on that end. That defense, along with his brilliant offense, is enough to make him the game's most effective two-way player, even if I don't think he's quite at the same level as he was last year. I think he's a strong MVP. At his peak, would consider him all time, and wouldn't be at all surprised if he gets back to that level next season. And finally, rounding out my list at 1, who else but Nikola Jokic. Anyone who's made it this far into the video probably just watched Jokic for an entire playoff run, so instead of getting into each nuance of his offensive game, I just want to focus on the main points. He might just be the most complete offensive player in NBA history. We're talking about a hefty 6'11" big, who can shoot lights out from 3 and the mid-range, has the most effective float game we've ever seen, and makes even the league's best defensive bigs look like food as he bullies them in the post. He has a seemingly endless amount of counters for scoring around the paint with either hand, has unrivaled touch, and is more than capable of finishing through contact, over or around perfect contests, and while completely off balance. This holds true for his shot making in general, throwing out all sorts of different fadeaways and hooks as he just puts the ball in the basket in a wide variety of ways. He's also an elite off-ball player. Of course, the screen and roll game is a big part of his attack, but you'll see him run around screens, torture bigs with sharp cuts, attack closeouts as a driver, completely dominate the offensive glass. No matter what a defense throws out there, he's got a counter. As a result, his scoring in the playoffs is incredibly resilient, over the last 3 years marking near historic levels of both volume and efficiency. And the craziest part, this isn't even where most of his value comes from. I could talk for days about his game as a passer. He makes the game look like a layup line as he hits every last cut, deep post seal, roll, and if any defender even thinks about rotating down, the team just has an open 3. Because of his height, he can see over the top of the defense at all times, but he also knows exactly where everyone on the floor is and where they're going to be even if he's not looking at them, a sort of sixth sense for mapping the court. This allows him to play every position on the floor in just one possession. He's a true point center with how he initiates offense. It's the same thing in the open floor, where he can grab and go, pushing the pace as a ball handler, or throw some of the best outlet passes you'll ever see like he's a quarterback in the NFL. The reason it seems like I only have good things to say about his offense is because that's the truth. When talking about how he stacks up historically, only a few players should even be mentioned in the same breath. In my opinion, he's the only one with an argument to be the best offensive player in the NBA right now, and I'd go as far as to say he'd crack my list of top 5 offensive players ever. The 3-level scoring, the all-time great passing, the off-ball game, and rebounding, he's truly a machine that has no answer. And I think everyone knew just how gifted he was offensively. It's the defense that raises controversy. In my rankings from last year, I labeled him a neutral and said I wanted to see a legitimate playoff sample in the context of a competitive environment. And I think it's safe to say some questions have been answered. For one, anyone who said it's impossible to win a championship with Jokic as your defensive 5, or that it requires perfect roster construction with a Jaren Jackson type of guy at the 4, these things weren't just proven false, but pretty badly. Despite not having quick feet, he moves really well in space to execute screen and roll coverages out on the perimeter. He takes away routine passing angles with his size, length, sharp hands, and positioning, forcing ball handlers to either turn the corner or make those more difficult reads way over the top, which is a pretty big value add. You'll see some games with 7 or more deflections. This holds true when rotating as a helper. Again, he's not quick, but the movements are sharp and done with intent. He's really good at preventing the ball from getting to the rim. Once it does get there, the obvious issues remain. He's not at all a vertical presence and can be late sliding into proper position, oftentimes just letting these shots go by as to not foul. By nature of his athletic limitations, he's not a big you can throw out there and expect a ton of versatility. But because of how good he is at playing at the level and how his size enables him to play drop, Denver has shown to be pretty scheme flexible around him, which is a big reason why they had a good playoff defense. Also, something that sort of flies under the radar when talking about defense is rebounding. A stop only matters if the possession gets closed, and Jokic is arguably the best in the game at closing possessions. If I had to label it, I'd say he's still about a neutral for me. In this run specifically, I think you could make a pretty healthy argument for him to be a strong positive, but against elite pull-up shooters who can turn the corner, I'm thinking Damian Lillard, Steph Curry, Donovan Mitchell, his weaknesses can still be exploited to some extent, but far from where he's this drastic, team-altering liability. Overall, that makes him the only all-time level player on my list. But I think it'd be really interesting to see how he stacks up against Giannis if he gets back to that level from a year or 2 ago. Just to recap my 1 through 5, I've got Jokic as an all-timer, Giannis, Steph, Kawhi, and KD as strong MVP level players. But what about if I considered health for the list? We can go ahead and toss out Kawhi, Zion, and Paul George for pretty obvious reasons. I think Luka fills in the spot at 4, as KD and Joel have concerns of their own, while Tatum leaps Dame and AD to take number 7. Everything from there stays the same to fill out the top 15. Kyrie had a relatively healthy year, Trey and Bam are both sturdy, and Jamal didn't really have any problems after his return, so they can all move up. This is where things get interesting. Iron Man Anthony Edwards jumps up to 20, with Jaren and Harden sliding up to 21 and 22, which leaves 3 unoccupied spots at the end. Rounding out the list that considers health would be Jalen Brunson, Darius Garland, and Jaylen Brown. These are 3 of the 11 other players I considered for a spot on the list, but just didn't make the cut. And for a profile on each of those guys, be sure to check out my website. You can find that link in the description. To stay tuned for some more content, make sure to drop a like, subscribe, and turn my post notifications on. Feel free to let me know down in the comments what you agree and disagree with in my top 25, and drop your list below. I'm really curious to see how you guys feel. As always, I hope you all have a great day, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.